quick introduction. My name's Darren Parker. I'm one of the senior account executives at CSTEM. I'm joined today by Oliver Pinson-Roxburgh, who is the CEO of defence.com. Thank you for joining today's session. I know everybody has a busy schedule. I'll keep my introduction short and sweet as we have limited time, obviously, this morning. In terms of being able to show you the defence.com platform and understand more about the compliance-driven cyber resilience for small to medium enterprises. Oliver, next slide, please. Guys, if you have any questions or queries throughout the presentation today, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be able to answer those questions throughout the webinar. So who are CSTEM? What do we do? CSTEM, as you can see, have been around for quite some time. We're a managed service provider, helping our customers evolve from a fragmented digital infrastructure into a unified digital ecosystem. We achieve this by offering and delivering a comprehensive range of what we call cloud smart solutions and services to our customers. We've got a very, very close partnership with defence.com, utilizing their powerful XDR and SIM platform to deliver our fully managed SOC services. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Oliver, and we'll kick things off in terms of the webinar this morning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Darren. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I thought I'd start with just saying a few preconceptions or common preconceptions about cybersecurity and what you might be battling with. And then there's a few things I'm going to try and avoid for you, because I'm sure you've probably heard lots of it before in the cybersecurity industry. But the key purpose of this webinar was to try and give something back, provide you with a bit of information around how compliance helps along your cybersecurity journey, and equally the other way around, it sets a bit of a roadmap for you. And each organization is very different in their approach to this. So I'm going to try and give you some ideas of things that I've seen in the past that have worked quite well and things that haven't worked quite so well, and things to think about. So the common preconceptions you might be battling with, things like, doesn't our IT provider already handle this for us? Do we need to worry about cybersecurity? Do we need to worry about compliance? Maybe even not understanding fully the gaps that exist because you're not sure what your providers offer you. And then there's the headache, which we're seeing quite a bit, which I'll talk about further in through the presentation, is around your suppliers, your customers sending you a load of questionnaires to complete around your security capabilities. So really understanding those gaps is quite important. The idea of like cybersecurity is too technical. This tends to come from employees where they feel like maybe it's not their job because it's a really technical challenge. And as we know, trying to address things like training and education in cybersecurity, I'm sure many of you have tried and found it quite tricky to get people engaged. So we'll discuss that a little bit. And then compliance is red tape and it slows us down. I've heard this a lot, and of course I've experienced it in the past, where when you talk to organizations, they're definitely battling with compliance, and it shouldn't really be that way. We'll try and address those concerns throughout. And then also the last thing, it tends to happen quite a bit, which is just that organizations have that feeling that they're a bit too small and they're not really a target. Cyber criminals wouldn't really care about their organizations. And again, we'll try and cover off some of those things to help you to communicate that information back into your organizations. Some of the things you've probably heard too much. Cyber criminals are getting more sophisticated every day. And I'm going to try and avoid all of these if I can. Compliance is essential if you want to avoid fines. No business is too small to be a target. It's not if you get attacked, it's when. And then people are the weakest link in cybersecurity. Like I say, a lot of these have been mentioned in the past, and I'm sure you're sick to death of hearing about it. And so before we get into the real meat of the presentation, I thought I'd start with a bit of a story. The story I'm going to tell you is about when I once broke into a building society. And it was actually the closest time I've ever got to being arrested. So one day I was walking with a friend of mine, and we were going down a high street in a big city in Wales. And as we were walking down this high street, we were walking past this really large building that was an office block. And as we did so, we looked over to notice that there was a side door And at the time in which we just happened to be walking past a complete fortuitous event, really, this lady opened the door and was throwing bin bags into the skip. She was obviously a cleaner. And so we looked at each other and we thought, well, actually, this is a good opportunity. Let's go. Let's see if we can get in. So we wandered in behind the cleaner. And the first thing we did was we walked straight up one floor to get out of the way of where that cleaner was, to obviously not get questioned about what we were doing. And the first person we bumped into was another cleaner. And so we said, oh, well, we've left our passes inside. Would you mind letting us in? And so this cleaner buzzed us through and let us through into the main part of the HQ. And again, just real luck. We walked into one of the office buildings. So we've walked down this big corridor, and as we get through the corridor, we spot another open plan office space, and we walk into that office plan space. And we look over and notice that there's a table that happened to have loads of passes, so door entry passes with big X's against them. And we must have found our way into the HR department in some way. So we grabbed these passes. And we walked back to the door, which we've just come through, and we tried a few of these passes, and one or two of them didn't work. But then, of course, we did find two that actually did work. So we grabbed these passes, we popped them in our pockets, and now we had full access into the organization, and we could retain access to the building from there. As we were walking around the building, we noticed a few things. In some of these larger offices, they have these secure waste bins where it's where you put all your information in that's sensitive, and then the idea is that an organization comes and takes it away. And we thought, well, actually, it'd be interesting to see if we could get that information out of the building. So we went back to the cleaners and we said, could we have a couple of black bin bags, please, that they were using, obviously, to fill with waste? And they said, sure, no problem. So we grabbed these bin bags and we went back to those bins, and we managed to put a lot of the secure waste into these bags. And we thought, okay, well, let's have a look around. Let's see what this building's got to offer. And as we're wandering around, we noticed that there was an IT department, and on the floor there was a PC with a hard disk in it, which we took the hard disk out of. We wandered down into another part of the building, and before we know it, I opened a door and looked inside, and we were in the back of a building society. So the headquarters actually had a building society attached to it, and all of a sudden we were on the front desk of what ordinarily would be where the customers of that building society would come into to discuss, have meetings in there as well. So from there, we thought, well, actually, let's have a little bit more of a wander around, and we found access to like a part of the building which had a server room in it, and equally, we also found that there was a fire retardant box on one of the filing cabinets that were nearby. And I looked at it, I thought, well, this says backups on it, so I lifted it to see if I could open it, and as I did, I noticed underneath there was a key. So I grabbed the key, unlocked this case, and inside it was their backup tapes, which obviously we didn't do because the whole idea of helping organizations to maintain some level of resilience would lead to us putting them in a big challenge there as an organization. So we weren't being completely malicious in our intent. So we thought, okay, we'll leave that. And we've done so much now, maybe we should just go. So we decided to leave, and it was raining. So we grabbed a couple of umbrellas from the office as we left to make sure we didn't get wet. And we dragged our bags full of secure waste from the building back to a hotel room, which we stored the information in. And the next morning we got up and we thought, I wonder if we could get in without us needing to go in the evening, because we were sort of walking down this high street the evening before. And so we thought, well, let's go and have a look. And as we did, and we walked down to the building, we realized that the same door was being used for people to gain access to the building. And we happened to tailgate somebody, follow them into the building, and then we were in again without needing those cleaners to let us through. To cut a long story short, ultimately, we went and tried a few meeting rooms. We put our systems on network. Actually, a funny story about that, as we were sat in a meeting room, somebody knocks on the door, and we thought, oh no, we've been caught here. What are we going to do? And as they came in, they were really apologetic, saying, we're really sorry. I don't know if you haven't booked this meeting room, but we've got this room booked. And we were like, no problems at all. We'll leave. It's no problem. And we even made our way into the kitchen and had made ourselves a cup of tea without anybody really challenging us as to what we were doing there. We made our way all the way out through the building, but the last thing we actually had as a task, and I'm sure you're probably all realizing at this point, I'm not a reformed criminal here. This was actually an exercise we were doing to test a company's organization when years ago I used to do penetration testing myself. Obviously now I don't do that anymore, but that was when we were doing a physical assessment of the organization. But this was one of the times, I've never seen this before. Since then, we actually had bribe money to be able to try and bribe somebody to see if we could get information out of them. And we thought, well, actually, why don't we just go straight for the jugular and go and ask somebody if we can buy their pass off them to see if we could get access to the building. And after many attempts of them saying, I don't understand why you want to buy my pass, we got up to £150 that they wouldn't sell it to us. And we thought, okay, well, it's probably best that we leave. As we left, we were heading down the motorway, and we get a phone call from our contact, and the contact says, you know, are you still here? And we said no, and they said it's probably a good thing because that somebody just called the police on you. And that was the time where we got so close to being arrested. If we were maybe 10 minutes, stayed around 10 minutes longer, then we probably would have had the police coming after us. So the closest I've ever been to being arrested. Needless to say, we gave the improvements. So the key thing for this story is that nobody detected us, nobody was looking out for us, nobody challenged us as for what we were doing in the organization. And there's a big part of the culture of an organization to push and drive the policies and procedures and the standards you follow to support the business to achieve their goals. And nobody challenged us while we were there. And we went back actually the next year to try and gain access again. And they had a security guard on the door, which was a good remediation step. We tried to go tailgate somebody in through the main office space, and we weren't able to. We did actually find our way back in because we managed to get in through an underground car park, which had a really slow gate that came down. And once we were in again, nobody challenged us, and we went through the building. Even though they had lanyards with different colors for different levels of access, we still weren't being challenged. So still some work to be done. But the key thing was that we were focused on helping them with remediation advice, ways in which they can not only find these things happening, but also remediate those steps as they go. So hopefully it sets the scene a bit for what we're going to be talking about. And one key thing I want you to be thinking about is, what is adequate? What is adequate security? It's different for every organization, but this statistic really brings it home. The World Economic Forum actually writes a report every year about the global cybersecurity outlook. And this year's 2025 report made the point, which I thought was really interesting, that said 71% of cyber leaders believe that small organizations already have reached their critical tipping point where they can no longer adequately secure themselves against the growing complexity of cyber risk. And my question back to that is, what is adequate? As I say, I'm going to talk a bit about what I think is the appropriate way of looking at this for your organization through the next couple of slides. But the key thing from the report, it also documents and tells you about, is what's contributing to the challenge, what makes people feel that cybersecurity is too complicated and complex for their business. And there's a couple of areas I'm going to try and address. And we're going to talk very much, like we said, about the compliance requirements, but just think about compliance and these standards around these areas and how you're thinking about your security. Firstly, of course, this big part of it comes down to skills gap, knowledge. Having somebody in your corner that knows about cybersecurity can help you actually address those problems and implement those remediations. The next step is, of course, just emerging tech. Obviously, we all know AI is impacting our lives and also in the business. And having a good strategy around it is pretty key to making sure that you stay safe and secure as an organization. We're going to talk about regulations and requirements and standards in a moment, but of course they are driving the right behaviors in businesses and also making sure that the companies that you work with are also taking compliance and cybersecurity seriously. A lot of the challenge I'm finding at the moment, and we'll talk about it, is just supply chain dependencies. Who are you using? How secure are they? And what could be the impact be against your cybersecurity if they get it wrong? And we've seen a lot of attacks recently have been down to that. It's not necessarily the business that gets compromised. It's their third-party suppliers, the ones that are letting them down. And how do we assess that in a way that doesn't become overly a big burden for you or for your customers? And then cybercrime sophistication. Like I said, I'm not going to dwell on that too much. I think there's different levels of attackers and they target different types of people. And so it's not necessarily that sophisticated, some of these attacks. It's just opportunistic. And we'll touch on it briefly, but not in a huge way. And then, of course, geopolitical tensions have an impact on how people see security and their strategies. So we're going to try and cover a bit about that. But let me start with the kind of general risks and the impact to business. The first is just the opportunity. There's so much opportunity out there. That's why we see so many attackers. Some of the more recent attacks actually were down to more attackers that were teenagers just trying to prove a point again, which is something that we've not seen for many years. It's always been opportunistic attackers or cyber criminals that are targeting businesses for monetary gain. But we're sort of seeing scenarios where actually schools are being targeted by their own students, and also organizations being targeted by people trying to prove a point. And the reason for that is there's just so much opportunity out there. If we just look at the US alone, there's about 5,503 compromised databases out there that we know of that are already compromised. there's something like 32,000 remote administration systems out on the internet that are great targets for attackers to get access to broad sets of people's environments with lots of access. There's loads of vulnerable systems out there. And in addition to that, there's something like 801 million ports alone open out there in the US. And that suggests that there's just such a vast opportunity for attackers. Of course, they're going to dig around and see what they can find. And a lot of it is really hard to attribute back to where that attack came from. So it's very easy for them to hide in the shadows. We proved this actually ourselves. We had lots of customers, the point I made earlier, where they said, well, we don't really feel like we're a target. Why would they come after me? And we proved the point by saying, look, an opportunistic attacker is just constantly looking at the internet for a next new target. And so we put a server on the internet. We didn't advertise it. We didn't give it a domain name or anything. We just literally just hosted a server and opened it to the internet. And it was found within 32 milliseconds of us making it live. And it was attacked by 1,963 unique IP addresses during that period of time, which was 2 days, 21 hours, and 58 minutes. So a lot of the time, if it's not an automated process or a piece of malware trying to target systems on the internet, it's going to be a human trying to target systems. And they're looking at the next thing to target all the time. And as new vulnerabilities come out, of course, it's a great playground for them to go and try those vulnerabilities out. And that could then target any organization, no matter your size or who you are. They might not even bother to look. It's just, they do sort of almost like a return on investment. The time I spend on this, could I make some money, or am I going to get some gain out of it? Or am I just going to be able to have a bit of fun to see if I could get access to somebody's system and cause some disruption? And each business is different to the impact that it might have on their organization, right? And what matters to them, whether it's downtime on the website because it's going to cost them money, or disruption to their business that means their customers get upset. All of these have each business have a very different concern, which we'll talk about risk and how you assess that in a moment. The AI paradox, I'm not going to labor on AI too much. Again, it's one of those things that's been oversold and over talked about. But one key thing I would say is that there's some really interesting statistics that show that organizations, of course, want to benefit from using AI, not just in the cybersecurity space, but just in general. And only 37% really have reported that within some statistics I found, having processes in place to assess the security of their AI providers. And more as AI technologies evolve, we're finding that they need access to more data. They're changing their terms and conditions all the time. They're changing their strategy all the time. And that really does change the way that which you can look at AI and being aware of what the implications are of using different technologies. And in the ideal world, of course, you choose one as a business to which you would like your users to be able to use, and make sure that then you have the control and the understanding of how secure those systems are, rather than them using whatever they feel like using because they use it at home or they use it regularly themselves. They prefer to use Gemini rather than maybe you want them to use Copilot. But just having a strategy to figure out how you control that and what the implications are. And also making your employees aware that it's okay to use AI, but we want you to use it in this way goes a really long way. All right, we're going to cover quite a bit of topics, but a very not a very deep level. So we'll try to also, if you've got some interest in particular topics, please let us know, because we'll do more webinars for you that will cover more detailed topics. But we're going to go through a few of the standards themselves and managing a few kind of frameworks and standards. The first one we're going to start with the Cyber Essentials. It's a UK-backed scheme. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. The key thing around it is it's about demonstrating the base level of security, in my experience, right? And there's 5 key things that we're covering in each of these different frameworks and standards, is around the key things you need to do to meet those standards. So the first thing with Cyber Essentials, it talks about your securing your internet connectivity. So that's things like implementing firewalls, putting network segmentation in place, and they'll expect you to have controls in it. And like I said, it's a very baseline level standard. It's not going into the full depths of necessary policies and procedures, which some of the other standards do. They talk about secure configuration, so understanding how secure your devices are, your systems, your workstations, your laptops, your servers. Also looking at access control, implementing things like multi-factor authentication is critical around Cyber Essentials. It's one thing that they really delve into in a big way. Of course, a focus on looking at your malware protection, but also testing it if you go down the Cyber Essentials Plus route. And of course, for those who don't know, the Cyber Essentials certification has 2 parts to it, one being just a self-assessment and the second part being a physical assessment, which is the Cyber Essentials Plus certification. So you need tools and technologies to help make this job of being audit ready really easy and simple. Otherwise, it becomes a bit of a burden every time you do it. And the idea is that it's a continual thing, which most of these standards are: continual improvement, continual updating, making sure the systems stay in line with these standards. So you can't just do it once and hope for the best next time around. You need to be prepared for it. And the last major one is patch management, just making sure your systems are patched. Getting all of these things right will stand you in good stead when you go through an audit, because they'll really be targeting you on these areas. DSPT, I mean, this is more focused on NHS. It's a framework that's used by the NHS to make sure that the NHS is protecting patient records and data and systems. It's a toolkit that helps to drive best practices around that. There's the National Data Guardian's 10 data security standards that it sort of helps to measure the performance against that standard, essentially, was what it's doing. And the 5 key points around it is leadership obligation. So what this essentially means is making sure that the leadership has got buy-in. And I think with lots of the standards, it's best to make sure you get buy-in from the leadership team. Staff training and their responsibilities, so clear on what they need to do, how they protect their data, and the responsibilities that are related to that are quite critical in understanding and making sure you've got the right controls in place for this particular standard. And then protecting data is obviously key, specifically around NHS patient record data is one area of focus around it. Reporting incidents, again, lots of the standards talk about reporting incidents. They have time frames for which you are mandated to report an incident and be transparent about it. I'll talk a bit about it briefly, but the key thing for me about incident response is that you need to make sure that you're not going in and presenting information to external parties that are not accurate and clear. Otherwise, you get yourselves into a lot of trouble. We've seen it before in big breaches where the press comes out and asks questions of these organizations and they completely hash it up because they've got lack of information. They don't know what they're doing. So it's better not to say anything if you don't have any information than it is to go say something, because you get yourself in hot water. And the last thing is business continuity. And this is a big thing that some of the other standards are now really focusing on, is business continuity. And we'll cover that in a moment as well around resilience. ISO 27001, this is probably the most familiar or the most well-recognized one out there, the framework out there. The one key thing for me is to say that it is quite labor-intensive, but it can be, if done right, it doesn't have to be. And I think the key thing I've seen with many organizations is they follow a standard template. So somebody throws them like an information security management system that's been tried and tested and used before, almost like a template. And then rather than people making it their own, they're sort of find and replace specific parts of it to meet their business requirements, but they're not really making it something that is aligned with exactly what the business is doing. And so then you're forcing people inside your organization, because it covers people, process, and technology, to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do, rather than just find out what they do and make sure it's done in a secure, compliant way. So the key thing for it is you have to define a scope for your ISMS. So you really need to know what you're covering, and you don't have to cover everything. And it's your decision to make sure what that is that you want to cover. You should be covering regular risk assessments. And again, it's important to make sure you get those and do those in an appropriate way. And the key thing is implementing controls to put in place, and then the continuous improvement of those controls, and requires top management commitment as well to make this really work and work well. But like I say, when it's done really well, it can be very slick. And also, if you ever have to be assessed against it, setting it up in such a way to make the assessor's lives easy makes for a really, really easy process for you. Like I say, it's not straightforward by any means. It does take time. It needs a lot of investment, and it needs a lot of people investment in it, but it can be quite achievable if you get it right. And the last one I would say is the DORA, which is a new one. So this was something that came out through the European Union. It's a regulation. It's aimed at really increasing digital operational resilience in the finance sector. So the people that are really impacted by this are more finance-based organizations. Again, we can talk a lot more about this and give you more detail, but there is also the driver for those that support the financial institutions as well that need to help prepare for this. And they need to put measures in place really focused on prevention, detection, and response to cyber threats. And also, the other thing that this now covers, which is a little bit different to some of the other frameworks and things we've talked about so far, is it also talks about just ICT-related disruptions. So this could be, somebody's patched a server and the patch has gone wrong and it just caused disruption. What's your resilience to that? How do you deal with that? How do you test for that sort of thing? I've increased the number of key points on this one to cover 6, because I think there's 6 really important ones. So firstly, it's risk management. Then it's third-party risk management as well. So making sure your third parties are being covered in this, your coverage of your risk assessments. Digital operation resilience testing. So can you test your system's resilience, and how do you do that is quite key. And making sure that you got a good test. We see this with incident response as well, which is the next part of it. There's just having a very clear incident response plan and knowing how you can respond to it is quite critical. And testing it's quite hard. You can do tabletop exercises, but I think sometimes those things become quite laborious, boring, and maybe don't really achieve a great goal because it's all paper-based, and so to really testing your security and your controls. So there's ways in which to test that in a more efficient way. And then it's about information sharing. This is about knowledge sharing into the finance, other finance areas, so other organizations in the finance industry, to share threat intelligence data, basically, and share where they may be seeing attacks. With the final part being oversight of critical third-party providers, which is a key part, of course, of most standards these days. So I'm conscious I'm sort of rattling through those, but these are each of the standards which we just wanted to give you a bit of a high level and understanding of, and what things to maybe consider and focus on. What I'm regularly seeing, as I've already sort of touched on, is businesses are being hit by this vendor due diligence questionnaires and finding it really tricky. Some advice from me is we have tried ourselves and also suggest to our clients to try it. If you have standards and compliance that you've met already, like ISO 27001, is to push back a bit, because some organizations, they just send you the questionnaire almost like a paper-based exercise. You read it and you think, well, we've already completed our Cyber Essentials and also ISO 27001. Why do I then need to still complete this questionnaire? What's the point of the standard? It makes a bit of a mockery of these standards if you can't use them to your advantage in these scenarios. Sometimes it works. I would also give like a bit of a disclosure out letter that you can say, we as an organization take security seriously, have a bit of a pack that you can supply to people. That means that you can try and fend off some of these. But it doesn't always work. Like I say, some will still require you to go through the process of completing their questionnaires. And unfortunately, sometimes you just have to be ready for that. I know every questionnaire tends to be slightly different, even though they're asking the same question. So you have to reword them. Again, you can use things like AI to maybe help you speed that up. But typically, I'd say that trying to push back initially is a good strategy. One other thing I see a lot for people is saying that their training is not really working and they're struggling with it. That's generally down to, like, I've run phishing campaigns and we still catch people. It's okay if you're improving your phishing campaigns to make them harder to detect, because people get better at detecting them. But if you're running the same tests every year and people still getting caught, you need to rethink your strategy a little bit and do something a bit more creative, maybe. One of the other things I see quite frequently is no incident response plan, or a lack of like well-tested incident response plan. Like I say, we've simulated a few attacks for our customers to help them to test their plans out, and they get a lot more out of it than just tabletop exercises. So maybe something for you to consider. We can give you some suggested approaches to that if you're interested. And then also an unclear monitoring strategy, or lack of a monitoring strategy. Just, we're ingesting log data, we're consuming stuff from all our systems, we don't really know what to do with it, and we're not really getting the most out of it. We just don't have the time to review these logs. Great if you have an incident, because you can always go back and investigate those logs, but mostly nowadays you really need to be thinking proactively about identifying stuff before it becomes a real issue. And also the main thing about it is that if you do start having issues seeing an attack, at least you've got evidence to go back to try and help understand how bad the problem is going to be and how you can address it as quickly as possible. One thing I would say, like I said, is some of these standards now, if you're having to do things like DORA, is many people are starting to ask, well, what's effective for testing for resilience? And similar things in ISO 27001, people go through the process of doing disaster recovery and business continuity testing and have done tabletop exercises. But again, similar to the incident response planning side of things, not really knowing how to get the most of that and finding value in it. And sometimes that can be quite tricky to execute. So again, trying to think that through a bit more, really think about what's achievable and get the right expertise in to help you out with that. And the last thing that I would say is a bit of a thing that people tend to struggle with is just assessing risk. And I've got some ideas for that a bit later on, which will help you hopefully, and some tools you can use, which we'll share with you after the event. The webinar. The one thing I would say is, though, if you're going through a number of different standards, a lot of these standards have overlapping controls and overlapping requirements. And you can see in this diagram I've tried to create here that just shows the level of overlap between a lot of these standards. Some of them are, of course, more focused in certain areas than others. Like, you tend to find things like PCI have got a lot of requirements, technical controls, and it talks a lot about specific requirements. Some of the others are a bit more focused on policy and procedure as opposed to the technical controls. And so I think it's worthwhile just looking at your overall map and your strategy, thinking, well, if I go down Cyber Essentials Plus, there's a good chance that it's going to cover most of the technical controls, But if I need to do ISO 27001, maybe we need to spend a bit more time thinking about our policies and procedures, or maybe they don't care about operational resiliency as much. So just getting some good coverage across will help you meet some of the other standards. So we're gonna have a quick break for a few Q&A and see if we've got any questions from anybody. I know we've been rattling through a lot of information, so if anybody's got any specific questions at this point, feel free to push them through, and we'll have a quick look at those.
We've had a few come through, Ollie. From the top, questions come through. Cyber Essentials Plus seems like a basic set of technical controls. Why is it so critical?
Yeah, I think in my experience, what was good about Cyber Essentials was that it just gave people a minimum standard to go for. Because lots of business I spoke to have got an aspiration to get something like ISO 27001, but it just feels so overwhelming. They needed some place to start. And so Cyber Essentials is a good start to get at least the basics in place. And that's the intention of it. It's not supposed to be like an all-encompassing standard. It's meant to say, like, look, the basics things you need to think about is, have you got malware protection in place? Have you thought about access control? And do you have multi-factor authentication? So it's really just driving people towards getting the basics, and a really good start for the basics. I think the statistics, something like, it covers 99% of the common attacks you're going to get, not advanced attack, but the opportunistic stuff, like somebody sending you a piece of malware, or a phishing email or something like that. We'll cover the basics to try and address those. So it's a good standard to start if you really just want to make sure you're doing something to improve your security.
Cool. Just conscious of time, but I think we'll have one more. If we handle patient data in a healthcare supply chain, what is the single most important thing we need to know about NHS DSPT?
Yeah, so the key thing here is, in general, is just understanding what your obligations are to the NHS. And the other thing I would say as well is just knowing where your data is and what data you have. There is a lot of support you can get for documentation and making sure you're addressing the requirements of DSPT, and communicating that back into your customers' information. So I think there's plenty to go through. It's quite an in-depth standard from a policy procedure perspective. So yeah, it's certainly something we can help give you some advice on if anybody does need support on it. Certainly reach out and we'll help you out with that one.
Excellent.
All right, let's continue on then.
Sorry, just had one more come through, Ollie, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
We've just completed the DSPT and have been successful in our area. Is there a system that can help me do it easier?
Well, there certainly is. We can talk a bit about what we're doing to help organizations as well, because our platform tries to bring as much of this data together. So when you go through an audit next time round, you're not having to go through all the hoops again, and it captures a lot of the information you need to deliver to each of these standards. We also work on a strategy whereby I would suggest that you prepare for your next assessment in plenty of time ahead of where you have to go through the process. And we've developed a cyber assessment questionnaire that we provide people as part of our platform, which you can have a play around with, which allows you to kind of prepare for your assessments and just answer those questions in a way that sort of does an internal audit for yourselves. And then it can track those requirements and also find a way to track, if you have gaps, your completion of those tracks, and also giving them out to other people in the business to support them. So yeah, I'd suggest having a quick look at what we're doing. And also I would say there's a few other areas which, we can help with, where we can give you a bit more tooling that helps to kind of prepare you for these things in advance. So yeah, I think it probably needs a bit of a conversation separately about what you can do, but there's tons of tools and things that help support that process for the next time around. Spreadsheets and things like that tend to be just really hard to manage, so I wouldn't advocate for doing that if that's what you're doing so far.
Thanks, Ollie.
All right, very good. Thanks for the questions. Appreciate that. Just a quick point to mention as well. I'd say a lot of this comes down to smart prioritization over big spending, by the way. I think a lot of people get that misconception, or the business maybe has this feeling that you've got to spend a ton of money on security. You don't really have to. You don't need a massive budget, but you do need to invest strategically. I've seen a lot of people waste money on the wrong technologies or the wrong processes, or implementing something that just really hasn't worked. So focus on risk-based approach. Make sure you're looking at cost-effective controls, like prioritizing the high-impact, low-cost measures that give you the biggest return on your investment ultimately, and knowing what those are. And certainly focusing on the proactive where possible. So smart spending on prevention as opposed to reaction is quite a critical part, because the key thing you don't want to be doing is just bombarding somebody internally with having to remediate or to action a load of threats, when you could have just addressed the problem upstream to make sure you don't get to the point where somebody's got to investigate these attacks or potential compromises. The next couple of slides, I'm just going to briefly touch on them, but one thing I see quite frequently is people don't know how to assess risk and prioritize. Apologies for those who've got a pretty strong process. One thing I would say as well that I see quite common is people haven't got a very clear way to document risk. So a brief overview of this is, a risk is, I like to say, a combination of the cause, the event, and the consequence. So that if you were to write it out for your organization, you could say something like, as a result of this X cause, an uncertain event, a future event may occur, which can lead to X. So once you've documented it that way, then it helps the business to understand those problems better. And once you've done that, then there's a very clear way to score these, which I can give you a bit of a framework around, where you look at the impact of that potential risk happening. And if it's a massive impact, then you can start to see, well, actually, we're looking at this top row here. And then if it's almost certain that it's going to happen, so the likelihood is almost certain, then you know that there's going to be a critical event, which you can then set some objectives to say, what's the time frame in which you need these things to be fixed? So what I would suggest is having something similar to this when you're assessing your risk. And also, if you're looking at your overall investment in cybersecurity, understanding what this can support to make sure that you're assessing your risk to get that right return on investment. So we'll share some information about that further later on or as a handout. The other thing I would say as well is compliance is a journey most people don't have. So if you the time for, I would say if you get security right, compliance almost comes along on the journey with you. So putting in those controls and thinking about those risk assessments will really stand you in good stead. So if we go back to that, what's contributing to the challenge, the complexity, we've covered some of these areas through the compliance requirements. I'll briefly talk to you about some of the core components that I think people need to put into place. So the first thing is understanding your risk. So really understanding how to spend your time. But certainly a lot of the standards have these common controls in place, right? So implementing encryption and MFA, making sure you've got a way to detect, respond, and monitor for suspicious activity in your network and your systems. Also regular testing, network security testing, application testing, all of these key things were requirements for many of the standards, as well as having a very clear asset inventory. And like I say, this is not an exclusive list, but with these things in place, governance compliance will come along that journey with you. And so a couple of things just to think about. Start with understanding risk, running assessments to understand what your risks may be. So maybe you don't have a business risk that you can associate, but if you look at your security risks, the actual vulnerabilities you might have, you'll find that there's things that you need to prioritize. So figuring out what they are and what your risks are is really critical. We have tools that enable you to do that, like our recon tool. We can provide you, by the way, at the end of this, anybody who's joined the session will provide you access to be able to run your own assessment in our tooling for free, as well as some application testing. So we'll cover those off. And if you're interested, we can get you set up to have a play around with the tool to enable you to understand that risk a bit better. What are you protecting? That's the key thing, right? Implementing encryption, we do assessments for people to understand where they've got the right encryption in place, they've got multi-factor authentication turned on, but also continue monitoring that. We've seen scenarios where people's accounts have been compromised because somebody forgets to turn on MFA. And one of the recent attacks I saw, actually somebody managed to get access to Teams meeting with somebody and then sent a phishing link through into Teams, which then somebody, of course, clicks because it feels like you're in a place to trust. Much like when I broke into the building society, I was a trusted person once I was in. Similar things with these Teams and email compromises. People that feel like you're in your trusted places. But getting this configuration right is quite critical, and prioritizing those critical risks is a key thing. The key thing around an incident response plan is making sure you're comfortable, that you feel safe, that if anything happens 24/7 out of hours, you've got somebody taking action immediately to reduce the impact of that breach, right? So containing it as quickly as possible. But the key thing is the remediation. Making sure it doesn't happen again is something that people often miss. And so getting that right is really key. We provide tooling, and we also provide expertise to help assist you with that and be that extra pair of eyes and ears and expertise behind you if you need it with the team system and ourselves as well. We help pick businesses out to address those problems. And then, like I said, the perimeter, we've seen, like, systems are being scanned all the time on the internet. It's a big risk that if you don't patch those systems before they get put out on the internet, there's a good chance you're going to get hit pretty quickly. So making sure you understand what your application security vulnerabilities are and your vulnerabilities are of your assets is going to be a key one. And like I say, a lot of the standards require you to have some sort of asset inventory. So Cyber Essentials especially, we help people build their inventory with our tooling and also maintain a continual compliance profile so they can continually assess them against the Cyber Essentials so you're ready for that next audit without having to lift a finger in some cases. And the last thing I think is critical these days with what we're seeing in the news and all over the place now is just making sure you're proactively looking out for those attacks and those early signs of indicators of attack, because that's going to help you address your problems. So I know we've gone a little bit over time. I think we waited a little bit. We're going to rattle through the last few bits, and I'm going to hand back over to Darren. Like I said, get the basics right, and compliance will help you out, help you to get on that journey and sort your requirements. And the key thing is this security roadmap, which we'll share afterwards, which is just setting clear objectives and priorities, making sure you're layering your security strategy, get an incident response plan. Compliance alignment will come with those controls, and making sure you're monitoring and continue that regular improvement. They expect you to have regular improvement in a lot of these standards. So keeping an eye on those things is key. So I'm going to hand it back to Darren, and he's going to wrap it up for us.
Thanks, Ollie. Listen, big thank you to everybody that's attended today. I know we've got a little bit over time, so thank you once again for sticking with us. Next steps from our perspective, we'll get some information sent out to you guys, as Ollie touched on. We'll be contacting you, sending out the recording as well, a link to the recording of this webinar. And for everybody that's attended, as a way of thank you, we'll also be offering free assessments, a free application scanner as well, which we can discuss with you in more detail when we reach back out to you. Don't hesitate to contact us if you've got any questions, any queries. My details are there. I'm sure you've all been contacted as well by John Hughes at our end. But thank you once again for your time, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again shortly.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.